Welcome to the Second Renaissance podcast. Artists, activists, contemplatives, and visionaries forging pathways through the Metacrisis to a second Renaissance and a wiser, weller world.
Welcome. Today we're joined by Zak Stein, Dr. Zak Stein, who was trained at the interface of philosophy, psychology, and education. And he now works in the fields related to the mitigation of global catastrophic risk. He's a co-founder at the Civilizational Research Institute. He's a co-founder at the Center for World Philosophy and Religion, and also was a co-founder at Lectica. And today with Zak, I want to talk a little bit about, his journey and your journey, Zak, to this area. Like, how did it kind of come to be that you're working in these topics? What brought your interest? And maybe we could begin right at the beginning. Your schooling, or even your early years. Like, what was there anything unusual in the way of your childhood, or will you have a very ordinary childhood and schooling? Tell me a bit about that.
Yeah, I'm happy to. And it's good to be here. Good to be back. Let's see. Was there anything unusual? Yeah, absolutely. Early on, I was diagnosed as dyslexic. So that was like a pretty significant event in my early childhood and in schooling. And so I was probably first grade, was lucky to have Miss Dimmick, who was an incredibly talented school teacher. She was probably in her 80s. And she had a sister who was even older. So I had both of them, the Dimmick sisters, in grade school in Scotch Plains, New Jersey. And one of them had dated someone who was on Shackleton's expedition. I don't know if that means anything to you, but
yes, yeah.
So they were interesting, and they saw like, okay, Zak seems quite smart, and yet he is kind of messing up on things that are quite simple, like spelling and stuff like that, and certain types of numeracy. And so they referred me to special testing, as was possible in the school district, thankfully. Public school. And yeah, I had dyslexia, which eventually in graduate school, I would study dyslexia because I was interested in it. And so I have a lot to say. I'm just like, what is dyslexia as a diagnosis, and kind of what I had and kind of what that is. So there's a whole narrative there, but I didn't know that at the time, of course. But they were like, oh, Zak, is quite disabled, would be the way that they would say it, at a learning disability. God bless my mom, who was able to reframe that for me so that I didn't think that meant I was stupid. And then I had a couple other good teachers, thankfully. So that set me outside of a normal relationship to schooling. I felt that the school was a foreign environment in a sense, and I didn't judge myself by the standards of the school in the way that other kids did, because I'd been told that I was somehow different, right?
Yeah.
So that was, I think, probably great, actually. And then was lucky to have the right teachers who kind of, again, reframed that kind of diagnosis for me. But it made me also think about learning in general, because clearly I was not like, like I did fairly well in school, and I was articulate, and teachers liked me and that kind of thing. So I was curious, like, well, if I'm defective in some way or disabled in some way, how is it that I still learn? And then how am I different from my friend who's not disabled, who's somehow learning in the normal way, right? So there's this whole, in a sense, unconscious subtext that was just running in my observation of people, because I had been placed outside the normal circle of how people learn and engage in schooling. So that occurred. And then in that same context, I started to play music. We're talking like 4th grade, 3rd grade. My dad was putting a trumpet in my mouth, and I was playing music and listening to music, and started to become someone who identified as being a musician or being good at music, even quite early, in part maybe because I was told I wasn't going to be good at normal school. So yeah, then of course, as happens in America, we move a lot. So I moved from New Jersey to Massachusetts, enter a different school district, maintain that diagnosis. and kind of maintain the attitude of being distant from school, not really caring about school, caring more about music. So it's like so if you think about, was Zak a good student in high school? Answer is no. Was I like a bad failing student? No, I wasn't a bad failing student. But was I someone who you would think would go get a PhD from Harvard? Absolutely not. I was someone who was going to be a musician. That's how I understood myself. And so that was actually kind of a great period. I was very, very, very lucky to land in the right kind of school, and just massive gratitude for the teachers that I was able to interact with. You know, Mr. Bourne, Mr. James, the Dimmick sisters, as I mentioned. But was confused by the intensity of the competition in school. So, and didn't test well at all. So when it came to be SAT time, meaning end of high school, preparation for college admissions.
Yeah, I know. I did SAT.
Yeah, totally. I was aghast. I was completely morally indignant, and literally, and I have the note. I wrote a note, probably a 2-page single-spaced thing as a high schooler, and sent it to all the most important bureaucrats in my school and school district. And it was basically a early version of what would be my dissertation, which was about the injustices of standardized testing. And it was fascinating to see their responses. We're talking probably about 10 adults given this letter. That was, I'd love to find it out. I wrote it on like an Apple IIG or something, right? Like a very, very early like word processing thing. And so I don't have the file, needless to say. But yeah, it was interesting. Again, some of them were just like, what are you talking about, kid? Like, you're not going to get into college. That'll be terrible. They just were not tracking it, right? Other ones were just like, yep, like, let's talk. And I remember Mr. Weiss, my math teacher, taking me aside and be like, yep, sorry, kid. Like, it's set up to be this difficult competition. And, so he and then a couple other people also helped me see. I didn't do well in the SAT. And I decided to go to Hampshire College, which was a place that didn't require SAT scores.
Yep.
And with no intention of graduating, with the intention of being a musician, right? So that early trajectory was one that left me a little bit undomesticated, if I can say that, because I never got super invested in the extrinsic rewards offered by the school.
What about your parents? I mean, because they're obviously a key socializing influence. They were okay with that. They were.
Well, again, I was doing well enough in school, and so it wasn't like I was failing out of school or something.
Yeah, you weren't failing. Yeah.
I wasn't failing, and I had really great close friendships, and was I talk well. Right. So there wasn't any sense that Zak was like becoming a juvenile delinquent or something that's going bad. And then as a musician, I was holding bands together with other students starting in 8th grade all the way through high school that were competing in, battles of the bands and kind of like playing at adult venues and stuff. So I was doing the musician thing, and my dad, who would become a biochemist, kind of had done a musician thing too. So I think there was just a little bit, I got support. I was super, super lucky to not have parents who demanded I become a lawyer or something, and who were open to the idea that I could become a musician, even though later they would tell me they were concerned when I would I did drop out of college and go to try to, and they didn't stop me, but they were concerned. So again, I feel super lucky to be in that position. And then, so I was left a little bit undomesticated in one sense, in the sense of like, again, I was confused by the competition, kind of refused to compete against my classmates. What else was happening then? So it was around that time, end of high school, that I started reading mostly the biographies of jazz musicians. So I became super interested in like Miles Davis's life and John Coltrane's life and Sun Ra's life. So I started reading those types of things. And, to make quite a long and interesting story short, it was in those books that I found people like Blavatsky and Aldous Huxley and eventually Ken Wilber. There's a Miles Davis biography that features Ken Wilber's hold-on theory. It's actually fascinating.
Yeah.
That's not where I found Ken by chance in a bookstore. But by that time, I'd already seen the names that he was quoting as people who were read. I mean, Coltrane, perhaps most famously, was reading Aldous Huxley, both The Doors of Perception while he was doing acid and The Perennial Philosophy. And so the last interview Coltrane did before he died, tragically, unexpectedly, the dude was basically like, dude, you're so good at music. Like, what is next? What are you doing? Because he had played flute. He switched to alto sax. He'd done tenor sax and putting together different ensembles, like breaking the rules of jazz. And what's next? And Coltrane says, well, I want to be a saint. That's what he said. And he meant that in the Huxley sense. He meant that basically like, I want to pursue the higher states of consciousness and become like homo religiosus rather than just someone who's known for saxophone. I want to be someone who's known as a saint. He was aspiring to the absolute heights of human potential beyond anything in his field of music. And he got that from Huxley and other people, Blavatsky, Sun Ra too, kind of self-created mythology. So all of that became very interesting to me. So when I eventually began to read Ken Wilber very seriously, it was at that point that I started to think about philosophical problems while I was practicing and performing.
And that was in your early 20s or?
That was like, so I dropped out of college, tried to start a band, failed, re-enrolled in college. It was at that point when I was trying to start a band that I realized, actually, I can't do the music thing. I have to do the philosophy thing for a bunch of reasons. In part because I realized what it would mean to be a professional musician. I didn't know I had the stomach for it. And like I said, the depth of the philosophical issues and the importance to my mind of meditation specifically as a practice started to become more value than the ability to self-express through my instrument. And so that led me to Ken, which led me to read all of Ken's bibliography, which is not an exaggeration, in like kind of a couple of years, hundreds of books. And then I met Theo Dawson.
Just to check, so you had you started meditating at that point?
I tried. And then eventually, again, junior year of college, probably, I got my first like Zen instruction. This guy who had got it from Philip Capra, I think is the name, right? The guy who wrote Three Pillars.
The Three Pillars of Zen. Yep. Great.
So that guy gave transmission to this guy, Richard, I think his name was Richardson. I forget actually his name now. He had this little Zen Dao in Amherst, Massachusetts. God, this feels like forever ago. I haven't thought about this in a long time. And yeah, that's where I began to sit. So like that's where I did my first uncomfortable pretending to meditate, like sitting on a cushion thing that you do in your 20s, right? Like it was like so uncomfortable. My legs were like the main event, and just all kinds of thoughts and what are we doing, and then fascination with just getting the ritual right, And this was the one where you do the one-on-one meetings. With the koan instruction. So I started doing that in my 20s while reading Ken, and became interested in the whole question of developmental psychology, because that's really what Ken was saying. And then when you read the Buddhist sutras and you read other religious texts and then you read Kohlberg and other people, it becomes very important to frame. And so I became very interested in all that. And again, by grace of God, I met Theo Dawson, who happened to have a temporary faculty position where I was at Hampshire College. And she was working.
That was chance. You just ran into her.
It was complete chance. And I was working at a coffee shop, reading books all day, just like coasting through college. And then, saw Theo was teaching a course on developmental psychology. So I took the course. Now, she was working then with the model of hierarchical complexity.
This was when you'd re-enrolled in college, or before? Yeah, this is when you so she was working with Commons and models of hierarchical complexity at that moment, or with Fisher, more with Commons.
Yeah, so this was like 2001 or 2, something like that.
Yeah,
I'm 20.
Yeah.
She just got her PhD, had been working with Commons and Fisher, had a contract with the national security agencies. So we're talking intelligence agencies. And
2005 paper I've read.
Yeah. So that was where that all started. And so I met her at Hampshire College, and it's just like, you're like remembering the good old days of undergraduate. And I thought, because I'd been reading Ken and integral psychology in particular, where he lays out this notion of altitude.
Yeah.
I assumed like that's what developmental psychologists were doing. I was so naive at the time. And Theo was doing that. And then explained to me like, no, this isn't what everyone else is doing. Like, this is like a very rare thing that we've done. We've psychometrically refined this hierarchical complexity scoring system, which is part of this Neo-Piagetian lineage. And I just kind of got where it was. And then it became very interesting to almost bring some full circle here. Take the course with her. She begins to try to teach me how to do hierarchical complexity analysis, right? So which is reading a piece of text and assigning it a complexity score and then justifying that, right? Kohlberg had a scoring manual. Cheryl Arman had a scoring manual. Like Lovinger has a scoring manual. There's all these ways to score. So she taught me to score hierarchical complexity. It's a long, very important conversation, but the difference between people who have been and not been taught to actually do scoring. Anyway, so she was teaching me to score, and my dyslexia made it easy. It was easy for me. That skill that is difficult for many people to impossible was easy because of my dyslexia. And I can talk about why I think that's the case. And she was like, oh my God. And she was like, we're not working at a coffee shop anymore. She said, and then we started to work together to make this thing. She's of course, the brains. I'm like the little junior apprentice or whatever. And we built this thing that would eventually become Lectica. And it was crazy. It was like a lot different than being a musician. I switched from being a musician and kind of like having an interest in reading and writing to like doing so much reading and writing and really taking myself as a scholar. So then it was that relationship that got me into graduate school with Kurt Fisher, who was my advisor. I had no GPA because Hampshire College did not give grades. And my graduate standardized test, whatever it was, not the SAT, but the GRE.
The GREs, yeah, I've done them as well.
Was not good. And Kurt was like, nope, because Kurt had the power to basically get me in there. And then in my first semester at Harvard, I got straight A's, which was the first time I ever got straight A's. And then they let me in the doctoral program. But had I not done that, they would not have let me in because I did not have the credentials to get in. And then I was in graduate school. And it was in graduate school that I discovered civilizational collapse as an inevitability of the current degradation of the educational system as a result of the standardized testing. And that's really what brought me to that and a few other things that brought me to this realization that there's a deeper set of problems. But now I'm fast forwarding really quickly through graduate school.
Fast really quick. So let's back a little bit. So this is like the mid 2000s. You go to graduate school at Harvard, and you're reading integral and stuff. You're kind of, you've read integral things, and because for me this is an interesting question, which is you're also encountering the academic tradition.
I'm reading everything.
Which,
I mean, I'm
yes,
reading,
you're reading the whole,
six books,
the whole.
7 books a week. And then I'm living 2 lives. I'm living a life in graduate school that is in rigorous discourse with the leading edge academic stuff in human development, specifically mind, brain, and education, which was an emerging interdisciplinary field that Kurt got. And then I'm working with all these integralists and actually publishing papers outside of academic journals and doing integral theory conferences. So I've got these kind of like 2 tracks, which actually kind of get brought together in my second book.
Why do they get set? This is my question. I'd like to explore, because they are. It's like the rigorous developmental psychology type world. You don't really mention. One doesn't, or in academia in general, one doesn't mention Wilber. And Wilber maybe doesn't do himself some favors, we could say, and like maybe the kind of, I would say the form of prose. It's a bit sometimes, and the kind of footnoting. There is footnoting, but it's not of the kind of academic style and so on. And it's also much more speculative and willing to talk about things that aren't so kosher in exactly.
Yeah, I confronted. I mean, so again, coincidentally, when I started my doctoral program, this woman named Katie Heikkinen also joined the program. She had been working with Ken Wilber at Integral Institute, and she works now with Daniel and I at the Civilizational Research Institute. But I met her, and so I got to know Ken and the whole scene. And then Bob Keegan, Kurt Fisher, Howard Gardner, people at the business school knew Ken, right? So Ken was known at Harvard in those days, but because his work was not peer-reviewed, it's basically that simple, because his work was not peer-reviewed, it was more or less inadmissible in serious academic context. But that said, if you read my academic papers carefully from that time, including my dissertation, you'll see that I completely smuggle him in, which means that all the ontological suppositions that are the basis of integral theory, I found a way to get from other places that were academically kosher, which allowed me to, like in my papers for the Journal for Mind, Brain, and Education, suggest a biopsychosocial cultural approach, which is basically a 4-quadrant approach to issues of ADHD medication and other things. So, and I think I cite Ken in there, but I don't just like build the whole thing out in terms of integral theory. But then I have other papers from that period where I just build the whole thing out in terms of integral theory. But I had read so much other meta theory, thanks to Ken in a sense, and then also my own explorations, that even integral meta theory started to get contextualized by this broader process of philosophy that was becoming possible. So I myself was also, even though grew up on integral, by the time I was, midway, a couple of years into graduate school, was dealing more with other philosophers because I had read everything that Ken wrote. So I was reading Charles Sanders Peirce in particular, Robert Brandom, who's an extremely important figure, the work of my advisor, who was a philosopher, Catherine Elgin, people like Roy Bhaskar.
Critical realism, yeah.
Yeah, so there's this huge swath. So it was also that, Habermas, of course, kind of mixing and matching. So that was a hell of a period. Again, I was very fortunate to be able to read as much as I did and use that library system. But yeah, Ken, again, it's the absence of peer review. That's the main thing. And I think also the seriousness with which he took the religious traditions was a little bit like, freaked people out a little bit. But really, had he just slowed down and tried to get his stuff peer reviewed? Now, could it have been peer reviewed? Probably not. No, it wasn't, because the other problem is postmodernism. So that's another conversation. So that brings us up to...
Because Ken didn't have a lot of truck with postmodernism quite early in a good... I mean, he saw the value in it, but was critical of it. But I guess it's just a question before I come back to that, which is kind of... I mean, Fisher obviously, I think Kurt Fisher passed away a couple of years ago, if I'm now remembering, 2023. And Theo, when I spoke to... I mean, there's something it seems that stream in academia, particularly the Harvard Graduate School of Education, which was like a fountain head of that work, seems to it seems to be kind of a topic in eclipse in a way, while it might be the most important topic we could be studying. Or am I misunderstanding? But
I don't know. You're right. That's what, again, postmodernism in the academy took developmental psychology out of play for the most part. I mean, the psychoanalysts were first, and then they came for the developmental psychologists. So yeah, it's a quite remarkable situation. Actually, the Harvard Graduate School of Education was home first to Erik Erikson, Piaget when he was stateside, because Kohlberg was there, and then Gilligan was there, and then Armin was there, then Commons was there, Fisher was there, Keegan was there, Howard Gardner was there. Now no one is there who does developmental work.
Yeah.
And the way that the way that the kind of baby boomer developmental psychologists set up shop left very few students, meaning like very few people carrying forward the lineage of those traditions, in part because you couldn't get a tenure track job if that was your main event. Rare exceptions to this, like Mike Moskalo, who should probably be running the Harvard program, but isn't, I think, probably because of political reasons. So there are still people out there, Mary Helena Mordino-Yang, but she's a neuroscientist who works with Antonio Damasio, also a student of Kurt's. But in terms of just like your classic approaches to full lifespan developmental psychology that are rooted in Piagetian type thinking, these are not fashionable.
Yes.
So we have to find ways for that tradition, as psychoanalysis has done, find ways for the tradition to flourish outside of the academy. And that's something that psychologists has been able to do. And Lectica has, technological innovations and like that are, not just going to go away. So it's an interesting question. That was the other thing I encountered in the academy, because the other decision I made was not to stay in the academy, was not to become a professor.
Same. Yeah.
And this was in part because of what I was seeing in terms of the state of academic culture and practice.
Same here. When I was in a different area, but also an academic. I mean, just to counter that, you say that, I guess why I feel it, I mean, I was trying to understand a bit from the outside, and it was an area that I've come to kind of later. I didn't study as an academic. I feel it's quite a big deal, because while things live on outside, the kind of research, particularly in developmental psychology, like longitudinal work over a long period,
that's a huge deal.
It's hard. It's really hard to do outside of.
And it just and this is another thing.
Modern academia is very short-sighted. I mean, that's the other issue. Is it's become publish or perish. You need to produce things very quickly.
So again,
go ahead.
When I got the frame of basically what I would now call institutional decay as an aspect of civilizational collapse, if you want to put it that way, at least that's the way I started to think about it. Then it was clear that the academy was as broken as any of the other major systems, like the energy system, food system,
et
cetera. So that became quite clear and quite disheartening. Disheartening. Because if you study the history of psychology, and this is probably the case in most fields, although I know the history of psychology.
Yeah, so tell us a bit,
This type of event occurred. So James Mark Baldwin, who is, I think, arguably one of the greatest psychologists who've ever lived. I'd put him and Piaget up there. James Mark Baldwin in the 1890s, early 20th century, was mentioned in the same breath as William James and John Dewey and the greatest thinkers of his time. He had the first ever chair of the first ever graduate program in psychology at Johns Hopkins University, and the first ever head editorship of the first ever psychology journals in the United States. He was holding those, right? He was running psychology, and his approach to psychology was full lifespan, developmental, massively complex and ecological, deep, structural, really, really profound stuff. This is Ken Wilber is one of the people who resurfaced James Mark Baldwin as like a major figure. But then there was a scandal.
The brothel.
Yes, exactly. And he's dismissed from the academy. He goes to France, where he has an amazing career, and he gets the Legion of Honor, and it's but he's out of American academia. The person who takes over the editorship and the chair at the core of American psychology was Watson.
The behaviorist,
right?
Mm-hmm.
And that changes everything in the history of psychology. We're still recovering from that, I would argue, because it goes from Watson directly to Skinner. And then you eventually get what Howard Gardner was right to call a counter-revolution, even though it was thought of as a revolution of cognitive science. Cognitive science says, no, you can't just do behavior. There's something like, there's cognition going on there, guys. And Howard's like, no, it seems revolutionary in the American context because you're standing against this hegemon of behaviorism. But in fact, it's a counter-revolution because it's behaviorism that was revolutionary in the sense of like overthrowing the long-standing belief that we had insides, that we had consciousness. So that's just another example where changes that are like historical contingencies that affect academic departments, the future of funding in psychology in particular, has been significant. So the kind of dying off of this neo-Piagetian tradition in terms of its receptance in the academy is very significant. It's extremely significant. But again, it's not clear that in any fields that where the best work is happening is in the large graduate programs. It's not clear to me. I'm sure there are some places, especially places that need huge infrastructure, like physics departments and things like that. But even then, what you're looking at there is actually probably federal money that has set up a little bubble within the university. So that's when you see the institutional decay of the academic system, then you realize that the real amazing, innovative science, psychology stuff's going on elsewhere now. Unfortunately, it's going on in like military, industrial kind of advertising. Advertising is where most of the best psychologists went. Seriously, it's a real serious like subplot in post-war America is the transition of the psychological warfare apparatus, meaning the propaganda apparatus, into the advertising apparatus. So there's this argument to be made that, it's, the best work would end up being kind of like siphoned out to the fringes of this legacy institution, which main point, and Peirce was complaining about this in the 1890s already, that the main thing that the university had become was a justification for the status quo government economic system rather than a place where real open-ended, real science occurred.
Yes, and I think that's also really this point about civilization decay. Maybe that's where we come to, as you were saying, awareness of that. Because first of all, my own experience of academy was that not that there aren't really brilliant people who stay in it, and in fact, it's almost like brilliant despite it. But my aunt is a professor. I was a junior research fellow, and just like, wow, this was not an environment that people wanted to be in. And I think also for me, it showed up for undergraduates. So I was very briefly, I was, how do I put it? Admissions. I was sitting on the admissions group, interviewing people coming to Cambridge for economics at that point. And I remember at one point asking my students if they'd read a novel. I mean, this was then third years. And like, I don't think one of them, and it was like, well, we're doing all this economics, but it's like plumbing, like, Keynes said it's plumbing, but what for? And this aspect of constantly, well, what's going to be in the exam? And so I think both at the level, and it wasn't therefore, it's like just what the system has started to produce was this kind of rubber stamping. And that had flowed through even into the research section. I guess what I'm saying is that this happens though late in the game. I mean, in a way, modern universities are 800 years old. I mean,
Oh,
US context, they're much more recent.
That's what Peirce was saying. Is like, this goes back to the medievals, guys. And Peirce was a medievalist. He, like McLuhan, had just this tremendous admiration for the just pre-modern, which I do too with Comenius. But yeah, Peirce was like, we need to reinvent this. We need to get we need to think very carefully about the future of where real deep research was going.
Just to come back for you, where you were saying this other thread, which you started to notice in graduate school, was this kind of civilizational decay. That's when did you notice that? Like, why? Yeah, what came through for you to notice that you were like, and that was happening at multiple levels, if you like, not just perhaps there's the climate issue, there's the ecological issue, but in our systems of sense making, our systems of understanding, of research, and so on.
What was it? Several things. So one was having studied music and the lives of jazz musicians and being embedded in some of that culture, and then being at college where it was very left-leaning. I was super exposed to, like, for example, the prison industrial complex in my 20s. So I'd already seen something that was horrible and realized that's horrible. How did we make that? Right. But I wasn't in a position to do anything about that. And then I get to graduate school and I start looking at the standardized tests. And you look at the Atlanta cheating scandal, which is featured in my book, and it is horrible.
Can you tell us a bit about that? Say a bit more about that for people listening.
So if you go back to George Bush II, this is like ancient history for many people, but No Child Left Behind was created. The subtle bigotry of lowered expectations. This was his phrase. The subtle bigotry of lowered expectations was his like third way conservatism of saying, we can't just be nice to the kids. That's lowering expectations. We have to somehow put in standards. So they do a nationwide standardized testing blitz, which makes school district money and teacher pay contingent upon continual improvement in test scores year over year, which any statistician knows is impossible to have continual improvement in test scores year over year for a school district, right? So right there, they're literally set up to fail. And then disproportionately punishes schools that do bad rather than give more resources to schools that do bad, right? So it's like, So it's like, and I lay this out in my first book, which was about basically justice and testing. And the Atlanta cheating scandal, as you can imagine, if you set up a system that way, you're incentivizing a need for superintendent level interference in testing. So that's what happened in Atlanta. Basically, the superintendent of the Atlanta school made a deal with the businesses in Atlanta that were trying to bring employees to Atlanta, that the Atlanta schools would be showing year over year improvement, no matter what. And so she organized from the top down through the principals to the teachers, the largest cheating scandal in American history. It's not as big as some of the ones that have occurred in India, but that's just because of the disproportionate size of the populations. But this Atlanta one was serious. So you have a superintendent telling the principals to tell the teachers to come in on the weekends and literally change the Scantron scores. And then that becomes known, essentially. And then you have kids who are basically, the test should be letting this kid get diagnosed as needing special help, but the kid aces the test. And then the parent comes in and is like, there's no way my kid aced this test. And then the teacher's like, yeah, well, you shouldn't complain, but we've been, making sure that the school doesn't get defunded. Kids know that the cheating is occurring. Kids are hiding under their desks because they don't want to get in trouble because they know that the teachers are cheating. So an entire generation of kids in that district gets their entire understanding of what adults are like destroyed. And then, of course, that, so that's an example. So I start to see that kind of stuff. That's an example of institutional decay, and also like
can I ask a question about that? I mean, because I think there's something also subtle about it, right? Which is I mean, there's a great part in the documentary. I don't think it's The Power of Nightmares, but this aspect of metricization that has pervaded, and there's something that represents a very deep ideological kind of end game of all that can be measured, all that matters can be measured, and then we're going to measure it. It's not distortion. I mean, because this is so well known that teaching to the test and all these much more subtle scandals, if you like, or deformities or corruptions of the system that are occurring, that epitomizes as you're describing.
Exactly.
Why do you think that's happening though? I mean, there's, just to go a bit deeper, what is your view? Is because maybe it's just George Bush, but there's something generally
going on. That's
on.
what I saw. Like the same thing that made them do that to the schools. They're basically doing that, and like that is in quotations and underlined as like this big, what is that? That is a certain way of thinking about how to solve problems that makes the problem worse while giving you a sense that it's being made better. That's what that is. And that occurs in food systems, medical systems, education systems, prison systems, name it. And that's what I saw. It's like this insight. And then I saw it named a bunch of different ways. Habermas named it, like Adorno and Horkheimer named it, like the Marxists named it. Ivan Illich named it. There were a bunch of names for that mistaken generator function of institutional process, which ends up being self-terminating. So I met Daniel Schmachtenberger in 2015. I'd met Mark Gaffney in 2010. I met Ken for the first time in probably 2008. All those guys were talking about the fragility of the civilization and basically the generative dynamic that was driving it towards collapse. And I had kind of was researching that in one domain of education, and then seeing how it applies everywhere. Seeing people I loved, profoundly injured by pharmaceutical drugs, and seeing myself be put in student loan debt, and, seeing aging relatives like in exploitative, like old home care, like everything becoming a profit center, everything becoming metricized, because to monetize, you have to metritize, right? So there's this huge inside this huge like rabbit hole, which I gave a bunch of presentations about and wrote about on measurement. And it's a chapter in my second book on the measurement crisis, the planetary scale measurement crisis. So there's a bunch of stuff like that could be a whole podcast just talking about that. There's all of this crazy stuff going back to ancient Mesopotamia about these processes of measurement enabled abstraction and accumulation and exploitation. So all of that became clear. Now it would become much clearer as I got into a whole bunch of other research after graduate school, as I, precariously pursued a route as an independent scholar, trying to kind of create these contexts where I could do serious work. But yeah, that very first insight came from the combination of seeing the kind of African-American experience in the prisons, frankly, and then seeing the standardized testing thing, and then seeing the medical industry thing, the iatrogenic harm crisis. And then again, meeting Daniel, meeting Mark, meeting Ken, and seeing these extremely deep analyses of the situation, it just made it seem like there was nothing that I could do that wasn't trying to work on that issue. So that when I was please.
Just to ask there, and then we'll come back to the path. To what extent I feel measurement, one of our first projects at Life Itself that never really yet went anywhere was like, why is metrics? Do you throw, what, and it comes back. I mean, there's a big link obviously to value perception and value and what is, because, and what I would even define wisdom, or I don't want to define wisdom, but what I would feel one aspect of it is both to sense the good, to be able to make choices around goods, not maybe the ultimate good, but where that flows out in wise ways that don't mean that you have an answer. But to come back, to what extent do you feel this measurement obsession is symptom or disease? I feel it's kind of part of both. But as you said, it represents abstraction, it represents misunderstanding what can be valued. I mean, it was my biggest thing I was having in economics, where I was trying to do like Buddhist economics stuff, was, what can be measured.
Right.
This misunderstanding, there's a drunken and a lamppost critique, which is people start basically just focusing on things can be
Yes.
measured.
Right.
They don't understand the distortion effects. But at some level, I started to feel that these things also represent a disease of almost a deeper level of rationality or abstraction about like what is kind of the way we see reality, and the measurement is more like symptom, the use of measurement. But I'm just trying to ask, is like, what way do you feel it relates to deeper ideologies? I mean, this is where also for the connection with McGilchrist and others and your work.
Yep, totally. I mean, it's again, there's that whole chapter in my second book, and then other places where I've tried to get pretty formal about this. Now, the way I answer this now is different than the way I would have answered in graduate school when I wrote that book. But like the way I answer it now takes me back to the magic of measurement for ancient man, for ancient humans. So that's where I think you have to get is if you start to look at the things that would make us distinct from the animal world, there's a whole bunch of them that kind of co-emerge, but one of them would be measurement, and specifically the turning of phenomenological time into objective time. So arguably the first measurement instrument that you find is made by a priestess who is marking the days to track her cycle. And then that becomes linked to, which is just a stick that she's marking. This is like a very ancient archaeological find. William Irwin Thompson presents its evidence. There could be older ones now. That begins this process of trying to instantiate in the physical world something that can make objective the movement of time. So this is why the very, very, very ancient sacred archaeological sites are always also astronomical observatories, meaning they're physical structures like Stonehenge, which are related to the solar system and its movements specifically, which allow us to make objective what would otherwise just be an expanse of phenomenological time. So some of the first measurement instruments that emerge are about that, and they give the quality of sapience to experience, time boundedness through the objectification of time. And so measurement is this deep, deep thing that was at the source of our religious life for a very long time. That's, I think, the way to view it is that what you measure, how you measure, is a sacred act. So the problem with our current measurement systems is their desacralization, and that the right approach to measurement, and I think all powerful technologies, is to hold them with a much greater sense of humility, sacredness, power. So like before the metric system in Europe, there's this great book called Measures and Men by this guy. His last name is Kula, Kulu. This like really interesting sociological analysis of medieval measurement systems in Europe. Nerds like you and I would really enjoy this book because it's really about economics. It's like, how do they measure how much vodka you get? Right? Like you go to different tavern and they have different sized glass because there is not a standard ounce. And so how do you know if you're getting gypped? You give them the money, which is standard, right? Although you could chip the money because it's actually the metal that's valuable in the money. So you could chip the money to make it less valuable and melt another coin out of it. But you give the standard money, he gives you this. How do you know that's the same size? So there's all of this medieval lore about all the places in hell for the bartenders that fiddle with the glasses that gyp you, right? So you get it? So they're looking at metrological injustices due to non-standardization. So this is a huge theme in medieval religious literature, was what is the just measure? What is the right measure? Right? All of these things draw back to the sacred authority required to implement measures. right? So the king's foot, it's a foot, literally his foot. So every time the king came, he would change the length of the foot to reflect his foot. So there were all of these ways that in measurement was taken as so profoundly ethical and important. Like if you went to one medieval marketplace and they did not do the measurement thing well, you would not go back to that medieval marketplace. You would go to a place where the king was able to ensure that there was fair measurement practices. Or you would go someplace else. You would exit that economy. You would exit it. So it became very important, very problematized. I got into that whole thing because I wanted to say that it used to be. Wait, one last thing is that it was super inappropriate to measure people. This was a very interesting point of lore in like medieval Poland, which was basically like, do not apply measures to people. Don't come and like measure, like with tape, measure how tall someone is. Don't put someone in something that would be like a scale to measure them. Don't take temperature. There was a practice where the doctor, if someone was sick, one of the things they would come and do is just take measurements. That was the only time you were allowed to do that. And the mystical power of being measured, just being made into object through technological intermediary, was enough to induce something probably like a placebo effect. But the whole point there was it was so taboo. Like measures were so powerful and sacred. The idea of applying them to certain things, you just don't apply them to certain things, right? Like, and then the idea that if you violate metrological norms, like if you are the guy in the marketplace who works with a crooked scale, you go to hell immediately, like much more so than someone who like does other stuff that's bad. But then you fast forward through modernity, and now I go to the gas station. I have no concern that the gas station pump is not actually giving me a gallon.
Yes.
Because on the gas station pump, there's something from the state. The state tells me we've validated these pumps. If you go to the grocery store and you're buying produce by the pound and you put it on the little thing, that scale also is certified by the state to not be misleading. So we really got the whole physical measurement standardization thing done, but it was done by not by a scientistic. It was done during the French Revolution by people who were openly against the idea that the sacred should be the foundation of our measurement systems. Interestingly enough, one of the reasons the United States does not follow Europe in adopting the metric system is because at the time we were making that choice, it became clear that, and the knowledge was known, that the founding fathers and others, including people like Newton, believed that the current American foot was closest to the Solomonic cubit, closer to the Solomonic cubit than the meter. Now, the Solomonic cubit is
Masonic. Masonic,
but specifically Solomonic cubit meaning the measure of length used by King Solomon, given to him by God to build the temple. So that's, Newton was obsessed with trying to find the length of the Solomonic cubit, Isaac Newton, because the idea would be that would be the one true, the right measure. And if you knew the length of that, you could actually reconstruct some of the things that we have architectural plans for in the Bible. Like New Jerusalem is a certain size, certain dimensions, but we don't know what the length of the cubit is. And so this was like and this is at the sense of being numerological and quite mystical. And so again, the reason we have the America was like, nope, we're not doing the metric system, is because there was a deep Masonic connection to this specific length of foot. So again, little historical contingencies lay down these path dependencies that create whole historical eras. So my response now is we need to return to the sacralization of measurement. And that, yeah, it gets all, there's a much longer story there. That was like almost like just a spin. Yeah.
We can come back to just one, again, very minor point. I think you're tapping near your microphone occasionally in your gesticulation.
Sorry.
But that's very good. That's great. It's great. Take a moment. We could take a moment. It's been amazing. So I would want it to come back. So there's a moment you decide you kind of at graduate school, you're not going to become an academic or follow the traditional academic path. And what happened then? Like you're starting to see the civilizational unwinding, you're working integral, you've got this developmental psychology side. I mean, I've got a bunch of questions we can come back to there, but what happened next? Kind of in the story, what happened?
What happened?
You're trying to be an independent scholar. I
mean, I just kept chipping away at it. Like I got very fortunate to have friends who had similar attitudes about the kind of work that needed to be done in the world. And so specifically the collaborations with Gaffney and Schmachtenberger were formative. I left Lectica. I'd been there for 10 years. And Theo and I, for a bunch of reasons, decided that, there's another path for me. So I'm like, I always stayed involved, but in terms of my day-to-day stuff, I stepped back from that.
And this was around 2015. Graduate school ended was what 2015 or earlier?
I don't even remember. I was in the doctoral program for a long time, but yeah, I met Schmachtenberger in 2015. So writing, doing consulting, like there's a book that's coming out now called Remembrances of the Future, which is by David J. Temple, which was written in those years, which was written between 2015 and 2018. So Mark and Ken were cooking back then. It just for a bunch of reasons we didn't publish it then. So we're publishing that now. So there was a period of quite focused work during those days. And then when the pandemic hit, that was another major pivot in terms of the professional career. But yeah, I had
what happened with the pandemic? Why was that? It was a moment. What did that catalyze?
That catalyzed, I think, Schmachtenberger and myself maybe being taken a lot more seriously. Maybe particularly Daniel. The Consilience papers, creation of the Consilience papers. These things felt to me like a little bit of shift in the seriousness of the conversation about the state of the civilization, as if we were like talking about civilizational collapse for fun or to get attention. And then COVID happened and people were like, oh, you guys are serious. I'm like, we were serious about these risks. So I think that was, I think, significant in terms of just the change of tone in the way we were able to speak and be received. And the sense-making crisis stuff. Like that was the study of propaganda specifically as an educator during those years. It was a very powerful experience for me.
Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Just again, another system that for some reason, like I'd kind of known was a problem, but hadn't really looked at carefully. And then you realize, oh, we are decades deep in very, very sophisticated psychological warfare. So that was a hugely important lesson, which, came with the creation of the Consilience papers, in particular.
Can you say more? Like, what kind of examples of seeing that what were you seeing, and what should people read?
So the Consilience papers propaganda series captures that. Like it's probably 2 or 3 years of work, maybe less than that. Let's see, what are the main takeaways from there? A couple of them. One was, as a neuroscientist / human developmental psychologist, there was a obvious paradigm shift or sea change in the power of propaganda with the emergence of social media. So the first lesson is these are not your granddad's tools of information war. These are much, much, much more powerful for a bunch of reasons. But the first insight is that we've reached a point with information war where it is mutually assured destruction. And that was a very important insight for me, which means no one wins an information war now. Just like you can't win a kinetic war. Ultimately, a totalized kinetic war is an extinction event for the species. Like, think about it. Like, if you viciously bomb your opponent's cities and then you win the war, what have you won? A wasteland of bombed out cities? Like, that's not worth winning. So we've reached a point with information war where we've done that, where we've dropped the equivalent, we've gone nuclear in the culture on truth, which means that, okay, now your side won the election, but at the cost of there being any respected, serious outlet for discussion of politics in public culture. Right? So you destroyed the field in which truth could be discussed seriously. So this is, I believe, started to lock in pretty around the 2016 election, is when you went fully post-truth culture.
Can I ask a question there? So for me, my question would be, does the interlocking causation of what we could call technology, institutions, and culture, it's an ecology of causation. Is, though, this kind of post-truth, this destruction, a function of social media, or is social media exacerbating an underlying culture war? So let's say, the classic analogy, and it's a crude analogy, would be going, okay, the printing press was, there's the Eisenstein's book, The Printing Press is an Agent of Change. It's like, my area of study was information technology, if you like, or information age. What, in that moment, you have the Reformation, you have this huge culture war of kind of Protestantism, which represents, if you like, some degree modernity and the Catholic. And printing press exacerbates it, but does it cause it? Similarly here, is there like an underlying thing of like, this postmodernity, which is undermining truth anyway? You've got basically modernity and like what comes after it and a bunch of pre-moderns fighting it out. Is social media, it's contributing, but to what extent do you feel there's like something underlying that's causing this like breakdown in sense-making agreement on truth? Or is it's clearly exacerbated by things like social media, or is it a cause on its own? I mean, I hear what you're saying. It's kind of more a cause on its own. It's like nuclear weapons. We've always fought, but nuclear weapons have really changed the game in a way, right?
That's the view. Like, I would argue that that it represents a qualitative shift in our ability to do large-scale behavior control. So you have to understand that Facebook, for example, or TikTok, say different things to their customers than they say to the people who have an interest in their profitability and who give them money. Right? The people who give Facebook money because it is an advertising company. What does advertising company claim to do? Manipulate behavior at scale. What does Facebook tell you it does? Connect you with your friends.
Yeah,
connect you with culture, and you can be a producer, and So that's right there is the issue, is that this thing was designed to be large scale behavior modification system. TV wasn't. TV kind of tried to become that, but the commercial, it wasn't. But Facebook was, the social medias were designed to be, and built in light of Pavlovian and Skinnerian reinforcement mechanisms that were impossible to lock in terms of TV exposure or radio exposure.
Right.
So that's the other thing to get, is that there is a literal neurological dysregulation that's enabled by these devices that was not like, TV's going to fry your brain, kid. Dude, TV's so much better for you. Like, even if you watch it all day, than being on TikTok for 5 hours. And this is not about the messages. This is about the rate of frame shifting, flashing, condensation of information, disruption of attentional system at the level of the limbic system. So that induces a hypnagogic state. which then allows for the adaptation of preferences and behaviors and opinions without conscious reflection, meaning you're brainwashed. And so that's a whole, and again, this is not like, oh, that sucks, that's it after, like an unintended side effect of no. This is how it was designed and is continually refined in its design through scientific experimentation to be more and more manipulative and limbic hijacky, and then sells that access to your limbic system to whoever will pay. Maybe it's an advertiser, maybe it's a political party. They don't care. So in that sense, it's different than your classical propaganda, which was, top down from a nation state. This is more like your fifth generational warfare, where you've got multiple competing corporate and state interests that are all trying to get in on the information war to manipulate your behavior. And as a result, truth as a meaningful, functional concept in culture has been destroyed. And that means that what are you fighting for now? Like, it's the boy who cried wolf. Like, great, you won the election, but now you destroyed your integrity in the process of doing so, which means everything you say we take now with a super grain of salt. And you didn't resolve the multiple worlds that have been churned out of this, meaning like you haven't brought us together. You're still diametrically opposed in terms of perceptions of what's occurring. The unwinnability of information war, that it's a mutually assured destruction, and that we've crossed that threshold in many sectors of the culture, meaning that it is impossible to use language to resolve disputes.
Yes.
Which is fine, and that occurs in many contexts, which means your only option is to exit. So that's not a good situation, because that leads to just fragmentation and war.
Is there a connection there? I mean, for me at least, there would be, with all the developmental work and even integral, like the idea that we then, I mean, this one is like, how do we come back to truth and the temple work, but more like what kind of capacities, inner capacities. I mean, for example, to go back, you're saying that certain things get hijacked in us or our attentional system, but there are certain things that allow, you could say very crudely meditation or mindfulness or like metacognition, where we see what's happening to us and we regain agency or sovereignty.
Totally.
Does that mean, what are the ways back, do you feel, if any? Like, what are ways forward?
I've encountered so many American Buddhists are so propagandized and addicted to social media. So I'm just saying, like, in meditation, clearly, meditation is clearly, it's not enough to have you be rabidly a distributor of other people's propaganda. I'm saying, like, so that's I'm not going to name names, but so meditation is not enough. You can't think that you are immune from what the digital media is capable of doing to you. So that would be the first thing. So you have to approach this shit like it's some kind of extremely powerful drug, which means don't give it to kids. Don't be naive that you can mess with it. I think it's a cognitive complexity thing, but it's also an attentional system thing.
Yes.
And so both of those are disabled and they're related. To the extent that you can think for a long time about anything, you can think more complexly about that thing. To the extent that you can only think for a very short duration, you can't think through some types of problems in principle, meaning it takes a certain amount of time to think about problems that are a certain amount of complexity. So if you're addicted to TikTok / Facebook or whatever, you will be unable to do things like seriously, ethically contemplate a problem. So that's the first step there, is how long can you focus on something? Not how long can you sit still. But that's different from how long can you sit still and not think.
Yes.
How long can you focus on something that has a right or wrong answer or a more or less reasonable way to be thought about? And can you self-correct in that direction? Which means grappling with truth of the world, not resting in original condition. So again, I'm pushing hard against the Buddhist thing because many Buddhists, they believe that because they can be so focused and they're thinking clear about everything. But in fact, they're not thinking clear about a lot of stuff. Yeah.
To say I'm a complete integralist here, like I was bringing that up, is that you clearly would need an interwoven ecology of practices from multiple domains, multi-dimensional stuff. It's that would be, there's a kind of variety you'd want to put together, a cocktail, if you like. I mean, just to come back, because we were like, there's this point, which is how do we address the propaganda, but how do you complete it, like what it is? You were saying like basically no one wins the information war. We're in a different kind of information war. What were the other kind of key takeaways from the propaganda work?
Yes, of course. Several of them. So another one is that this is much deeper, long-standing, scientifically investigated problem than most people realize. That's the other thing. So that's why when you get to these statements, like it's designed to brainwash you, like there's the only reason you can take that seriously is by looking at this long history of the applied sciences to manipulative large-scale communication. And then the paper trails. Like, so there's a book called The Gray Lady, which is about the New York Times. All right, so the New York Times. What is the New York Times? Interesting question. I'm not going to speak in too strong terms about the New York Times, but it has been a propaganda outlet since its inception. So I think the getting very realistic about how deep we are in a simulation of reality that is politically useful, rather than how much great information we have about the state of the world as a result of our contemporary media. Right. So now both of those are kind of true, but you have to be a very discerning consumer of information to get out of this politically useful simulation that has been very, very, very carefully wrapped around us for decades by Academy, New York Times, Fox News, conservative think tanks, liberal think tanks, presidential campaign propaganda, to the tune of billions and billions of dollars of internally applied population-centric information war in your own country, which distorts all sense of how the country actually is in terms of what is really going on, to the point where no one really cares. And so that's another lesson. This is another lesson, is like, don't think that you have access to these things that aren't propaganda and those other people you don't like are being propagandized. No, if you're one of those people, you're probably the most propagandized because you're reading the New York Times thinking that somehow it's not propaganda, right? Fox News is propaganda, but the New York Times, you're like, no, dude, no error. Like, oh, but the peer-reviewed publications, those, nope, error, right? Peer-reviewed publications are paid for by who? Interesting, right? So all of that becomes quite a mess. And a lot of that is laid out in the Consilience papers, which try to demonstrate just how deep and long-standing the issue. I mean, it goes back to Ramses, like the pharaoh of Egypt. That's like propaganda goes back to obelisks. Like literally, he just put obelisks in places that in universally recognized graphs, like, hieroglyphics, showed the brutality of what he was able to do to the people who stood against him, right? And he would just have those commissioned and just like put out randomly just to prepare people, just in case, I'm coming, Ramses is coming. And then, of course, the grandeur of the monumental architecture also built in part to reconfirm the sense that he is a god. So the history of propaganda is super old. And then you're a communications guy, so then it goes through, print, electricity, television, into digital, and then digital just goes exponential to the extent that it's becoming like a mental health problem. If you include advertising, which I do, as propaganda, which just means communication intended to manipulate you rather than communication intended to inform/coordinate with you around reality. So if you include all of the manipulative communication that's directed at you, it's like most of your communication if you're online. And so, that's a mental health problem because there's nowhere to look. There's no one to trust.
So the question, there's a couple of things there that strike me. One is to emphasize, I think, that also what I call the jellyfish issue, it's like about capitalism. What's also a difficult thing for people is it's not that necessarily there's a thing, like when we say they're wrapping it around you, I'm not sure you quite said it, but we can often think of a kind of agentic thing. There's someone, it's Goebbels, in the Nazi party setting out propaganda. I think what's subtler is that there's a system. It's just like capitalism it's not like there's someone directing capitalism, but I like this analogy of jellyfish swarming through the ocean. They cause a whole bunch of results, but they're mindless. There isn't like a directing agency. So my question, is that the case here in the sense that it's not like there's someone saying, oh, we're going to, any individual actor is trying to maybe have some manipulation and has an intent. And the people setting up Facebook have an intent, but they end up kind of locked into a destructive system. That's my question. Or do you feel it's more agentic than that? That's a question. It's like, do you feel it's more agentic and, there's no one directing capitalism, but capitalism has certain results, like the rainforest maybe get cut down or something like that.
Right.
The part I always like about the jellyfish story is when jellyfish sort of die, they actually acidify the ocean, which make it more conducive for jellyfish and less conducive for other kinds of marine life.
Right.
They kind of create an ecology that they themselves create an ecology that hosts themselves and not other things.
Yeah. I mean, it seems clear to me that it's pretty agentic. I mean, it's both. It's clearly both. There are large emergent systemic effects that are not planned and that reinforce negative things, right? Like, I get that second, third order effects that were not intended. This is sometimes called mistake theory. Mistake theory, why do bad things happen in the world? Because people make mistakes. No. The other one is conflict theory. Why do bad things happen in the world? Because people do them, because they're in conflict with other people. And so I think both are true. Now, the sociopaths who run the world want everyone to think it's all mistake theory. Right? So if you are one of the people who are actively doing bad things, intentionally so, to profit yourself and acquire power and things, you want everyone else to think that, oh, you just didn't know better, it was a mistake. Right? So I think there's a tendency for us want to see there to be dominance of mistake theory. We want to see it just, no, people are doing the best they can. But in fact, nope, there are people who are actively, seeking to acquire power and aggregate power and resource to themselves at the expense of others, knowingly doing so. And then the extreme of this is people who are sadistic, which would be people who actually enjoy the process of causing harm to others. And that is, as a psychologist, that's a very, very real psychological type. So we can't be naive about it. And the largest scale actors, which are what we would call, let's say, hyper agents, who exercise incredibly outsourced capacity to impact the world, tend to all be on the side of, let's say, not very attuned to empathetic resonance with the millions of people who are affected by their decisions. So Zuckerberg, for example, clearly made decisions to populate his board of directors with former intelligence agency directors and build a company that could surveil the hell out of you, manipulate your behavior, and make a profit. He didn't do that by accident.
No.
That was a very intentional thing. Now, did he want to create political polarization in an African country that led to a genocide? Probably not. that was a side effect of the technology that he built. But he built the technology to be the technology that was being wielded by a board of directors with a bunch of intelligence agency directors.
What I mean is a bit more subtle in my thinking about it that I'm testing out with you, which is there's Zuckerberg, but the system selects. So let's say I'm Zuckerberg and I'm starting my Facebook and I want it to be, I'm taking off but I've got these good intentions. My suspicion is they wouldn't make it through the digital capitalist system. They would get outcompeted or something would happen to them. And so there's this kind of double order effect, which is it's true. And people with better intentions kind of would disappear to some extent in it.
Well, and if you're in the position of sociopathically maximizing your own power, you would then create an ecosystem around you, like the jellyfish, that would then incentivize that type of thing. So that's, I think, what we're looking at. And again,
Okay, wait, because what I want to insert here is then how do we start creating other equilibria? So how do we create where if that's one equilibrium going on, which is like what we don't, there's a lot we can see of we call it dark, I don't know if you saw the second Renaissance stuff I sent, but the dark Renaissance, there's the dark age part, but where is the rebirth? So what are the kind of moves that allow good, maybe even in pockets and small groups, for the kind of emergence of better faith communication, of, rewarding behavior that isn't like that? Or is that impossible at this point until there's a really serious breakdown? Before we need the dark age for the Renaissance to happen, which is what I call the dark Renaissance story.
Right. Totally. I mean, when I hear dark Renaissance, I think of Nick Land and Curtis Yarvin and those guys who are speaking exactly to these issues, which are, when you have a system that has become as corrupt as this system, what's the best move? Like, we have to not be naive about how much power is in the hands of so few people whose motives are not in the interest of everyone. Like, we can't be naive about that. And so I don't think there's some simple way that a bunch of do-gooders get together and kind of stand against those powers. And that's, I think, just hard to kind of admit, but it's very true. And as you're saying with Zuckerberg, good people get weeded out systematically. It begins also with the education system. So when I think about shifting from diagnosing the problem, which I think we need to do more of, because we need to understand who are these people, what are we really up against, kind of thing. And I think about what we would do if we were trying to do better. I would think a couple of things. One is, I think, how to say this? So back to wisdom. If you look at history and you even look at civilization collapse theory has always been goes up, it goes down, goes up, it goes down. Like highest periods, dark ages, high periods, dark ages. If you were really wise, and this has been how wisdom has mostly been understood, you would just chill out in the mountains and try to get wisdom down into the civilizations, knowing that they're kind of coming and going, right? So there has not been a form of wise planetary scale agency anywhere near as powerful as there has been unwise predatory planetary scale agency. One hypothesis for this is because that the wise people just kind of play the long game. And they're like, oh, go ahead. And you hear this from them. Go ahead and play your power games and your economic games. And you can't stand against time and the inevitabilities. And I'll just work out my system and practices and kind of slowly infuse them and do that. So I get that. But we're at a period now where there is
existential risk. Yeah.
Existential risk. So we're at a period now where there cannot be the same type of disassembly, reassembly, where we're at a very, very complex, pivotal moment. And so there's something like a new archetype of wise agency, which is much, 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 much less quiescent, much, much, much more political and strategic. And there aren't a lot of models for this, right? Because the models for the people who stand up against the system and try to do the greatest things are just models of people who get killed. Basically, models of people who aren't thinking strategically, actually. In one sense, they are, insofar as being a martyr is a good strategy. But in another sense, they're not thinking strategically in a way that would actually really change the fundamentals of the system at planetary scale in time. So we're facing a crisis of what it means to be wise. I've often talked about it being at least threefold, having to do with qualities of awakening, prophecy, and polymathy, basically, which would be a combination of several different factors, but that would include really rigorous engagement with realities of the world in the polymathy component. So max complexity intellectually, max maturity, personality structure, max depth of quality of awareness, right? Mm-hmm. So awakening, quality of awareness,
waking up, cleaning up, growing up,
something like that. So there's at least three. So wisdom is this multifold thing. And then the question of to what extent wisdom engages the world to transform it in a way that is as powerful and effective as the unwise engage the world to transform it. That's the question of our time. And what would that mean? Like, many of the archetypes of wisdom are precisely don't engage the world. That's the archetype of wisdom. The archetype of wisdom is like, yes, go to the mountains, like don't engage the world, you know? So it becomes a search for the appropriate archetype. Again, one interesting thing about the Hebrew, the wisdom of Solomon, just to bring it back to Solomon's cubit, is that the archetype there in the Hebrew tradition for wisdom would be a king archetype. Now, the king archetype is a very interesting archetype because it is an archetype that has to do with the engaging of power, specifically.
In the world, yes.
Power in the world. So as opposed to the wisdom of the image of wisdom being like sitting under the Bodhi. No offense, I'm a Buddhist, so I'm not trying to pick on Buddha.
Sure.
But again, the Western reception of the Buddhist thing is you go to the cave, yes, or you go to the retreat or do the thing, and precisely to the extent that you're worried and pissed off about the world is the extent that you haven't balanced your awareness enough. Whereas the king will truly be worried and angry about the world because he is responsible for the world. So this is this shift in this notion of what does it mean to be spiritual and to engage. And so what that means is like, we got to read The Art of War, and we've got to think about what is actually needed now. And my experience has been, great people who love the world and love nature and love children and these things. They avoid the kinds of lives that would yield maximal return on power and maximal return on agency, meaning that they're sane, good people who don't do the crazy things that people like Elon Musk and other people do to get themselves into position to be, rulers of the world. And so again, we're back to this like system that kind of rewards only a certain type of agency, which is and what would it mean to use our initial alternative agency to create new incentives to allow for more of a flourishing of the right type of agency? This is a deep question of our time, but we can't answer it unless we think first about the value of what we're pursuing in terms of these archetypes of wisdom.
Yes. I mean, we're very interested at Life Itself, and we talk about spiritual warriorship quite a bit. And the deep connection, I think you're writing with wisdom, and that engaged wisdom. This is not wisdom in this, at least one version of it, of the disengaged kind of sage, which I think is the waking up version, but without the other dimensions. I even think the integral version, if we wanted to put it in that term, of wisdom is
Mhm.
partly that revolution. It includes the showing up, as well as the waking up, the cleaning up, the growing up,
Yep.
the cognitive complexity, and what that looks like. I think the thing that's also just quite practical there is basically kind of how do you end up not going to the dark side? Like a big part of this, I think, is also about how to create communities which support each other in having ambition. You know, we've had actually a group here who kind of put out this thing about the Life Guild, but this idea of like, well, you want people to start having ambition in this conventional sense, and the question is, how do how do I know I'm not getting carried away by ambition? How do I know? How do we guard against what is often the dangers
Mhm.
of that, both in my own attachment, like it distorts my own being, all of those stories, the ring, Gollum becomes distorted by this, but also in the subtler, I think, sense of less even my own distortion, but my own blind spots. As I wield power, essentially of any kind, my inevitable blind spots are more dangerous because of the consequences
Mhm.
of because I'm wielding something much more powerful. So how do we create kind of guilds or groups or something
Mhm.
of to start with? Because it seems to be something where that the collective intelligence is a double level. It's not just us making sense together, but also us kind of supporting each other in those other dimensions, which are often the most dangerous. I would say it's like the trauma, the cleaning up, the things that drive us um, end up
Mhm.
driving us in the negative directions, even our craving for power that are there. So it seems like a really fruitful exploration, and this ability to sense value. I guess it brings us back to the subject of the first podcast of how sensing value is crucial.
Mhm.
And I mean, I guess I had a couple of questions there that just to kind of bring it to that, because if we put it concretely, like someone the wise actors would be ambitious, I'm hearing, it's like they would be open to playing the games of power in the world because that's what's necessary of engaging. They would be looking to be developed along the multiple dimensions and to hold the power wisely and well to, as you say, be polymathic, really make sense of the world. But I've got this question of sensing value, of sensing the good.
Mhm.
To come back to your book, this was a crucial part in actually, I think we've got we're here chapter 36, where how do people actually cultivate these capacities for you? How would you say we cultivate that capacity to sense the good, to sense the beautiful?
Totally. So let's see. So this comes back to, if we understand that wisdom has to pursue power, how
Hmm.
does wisdom not become corrupted by power? It would be by maintaining its access to the intrinsic value that is its ultimate motive, right?
And to
Um,
not use power in the wrong direction, because there are two kinds of dangers. I become corrupt, and
mhm.
I am become mistaken in the sense that I'm using my power now, but I'm going in the wrong direction. I'm no longer sensing the good and the beautiful,
Right.
either by accident or by intention.
Yep. Yeah. So that's a very important question. I mean, there's a few things to say. I think you're pointing towards community is very important, but it would have to be socialization starting at a very early age. This is one of the things to think about is,
Padilla.
yeah, who are you? Like, and to the extent that you have not been socialized to be wise, how do you confront that? And then to the extent that you have been, but you don't want power, how do you deal with that? Because I think that's what we end up with. We end up with this kind of people who shouldn't be seeking power are seeking power. People who should be seeking power are not seeking it. So we would trust a monarchy if we knew the king was wise. right? So this is the issue.
The best governance would be a benevolent dictator.
Correct. Or a benevolent king, a benevolent, truly enlightened king, let's say, something like that. And the way we would know that would have to do with the king's ability to demonstrate wisdom. This is back to the wisdom of Solomon, right? Like, so that would be displayed in the behavior of how the king administered justice and distributed resources. In terms of clarifying the eye of value, I'll say a couple of things. One is that truly having clarified the eye of value and therefore being in touch with what is actually valuable gives power, both to the individual in terms of it's empowering. Like literally when you meet someone, they seem more in tune with life because they're actually touching real value. So there's that. But then it also gives power in the sense of you're in touch with reality. So there's a whole discussion about how people who, so there's that. So there's the empowerment that comes from opening the eye of value. But then there are things like pseudo-value and anti-value. And what we're really worried about here is what we call anti-value, which really just means evil. So something's valuable. Getting the real article is empowering. So let's say like Eros, right? Having real physical intimacy is the thing. And I'm not talking about sex. I'm talking about like love, basically intimacy, love. Pseudo-eros is when you know that thing is valuable, but you can't quite get it. So you get something else that is an imitation of it. So this would be like advertising. Facebook runs on pseudo-intimacy, not actual intimacy. Pornography is probably the greatest example of the pseudo-erotic. But it still recognizes the value of the real thing. But then you have what's called anti-value. Now, anti-value seeks to destroy or possess that which is actually valuable rather than imitate it or be a second degree knockoff of it. And so anti-value is a type of force that is in touch with real value, which is why we're scared of it. Because it's not some like superficial, relativistic, kind of like glib advertising sheen on value, which is what the pseudo is, which is kind of a banal type of evil. It's a thing that really knows where to find the sacred, hunt it down to acquire it or destroy it. That's the anti-value thing. And so the more power you get, the more it is important that it is the power that pursues value for its own sake to preserve it, rather than the power that pursues value in order to destroy it. And so that's why many wise people move away from the halls of power, because they perceive it to be a place where only anti-value can reign, where only value can only be destroyed under pretense of being preserved or something, right? It's actually destroyed.
Can you give an example of anti-value? Like a concrete example, like so advertising is the example of pseudo value or pornography. What would be anti-value?
I mean, like rape, right? So if it's like actual erotic contact, pornography would be the pseudo, and then rape would be the anti, right? Or again, like imagine trees, the beauty of a tree. So you're in a forest, you're with the trees, you're feeling the trees in the forest. That's the actual value of the beauty of the forest. You can't quite make it to the forest. You don't have a long enough attention span to do the forest bathing. So you kind of like watch a nature documentary. That would be like pseudo. You go to the forest to find the oldest, most valuable tree, to destroy it, to sell it for lumber. That's anti-value. Now, it also, of course, converts the tree into monetary value. So this is important, like relationship between these different notations of value. So the anti-value is the pseudo-value can't quite locate it. imitates it. The anti-value goes right for it to destroy it, right? And so this is the difference between kind of immature personalities and truly psychopathic or malignant personalities, right? Whereas the superficial personality, it's like they could make some mistakes and, they're not really deep person, like deeply invested in things with a lot of seriousness. But the truly psychopathic person really is invested in things with a lot of seriousness and really is not confused about what is valuable. They just want to acquire it or destroy it or make sure no one else can have it. And so that's this kind of spectrum. And so when you're thinking about the clarification of your own desire and your own contact with the value, it's very important to have there be places in your life where you know that you have real access, that you're not in the pseudo. And then being aware that there is a mentality that you can find in yourself, which is hopefully not dominant in you, but would be in others, that actually instantiates the power of anti-value. And what's interesting is that there's like a pre-trans fallacy here, which is like the personality that is in touch with value is so vibrant and alive. The personality that's only pseudo is kind of like deflated. The personality that is in touch with anti-value is also very alive and very charismatic and vibrant. That's why we're afraid of charismatic religious leadership and charismatic political leadership, because we're in a culture where we don't have an easy way to tell the difference between the anti-value and the real value, because they both touch actual value, right? So it's complicated, super complicated topic. And we're running out of time.
Yeah, we should probably wrap it there. I mean, I guess there's a question we can leave for next time for myself, which is whether there's been an evolution or a degradation or ability to sense value, or it's more of a wisdom gap issue. What I call the wisdom gap is maybe it's not that we've got, the climate crisis may not reflect that we've got worse or less wise as a people. It's that we're able to destroy much more. Like 800 years ago, they were still cutting down the trees. So there's but it's today we can cut down all the trees. That's a thing we should leave for next time in our exploration. Is there anything you want to say just in closing remarks before we wrap for today? Just the last thing, or I think you've said a great deal, Zak. Amazing. So you don't feel you have to say more anything, but is there anything you wanted to get to leave with?
I don't think so. I mean, I think this is, we ended up in a very kind of like profound place thinking about what the causes of the metacrisis are that are internal to people's psychologies. And kind of put a little challenge forward, which is like, how do we get the wisest people who want to truly do good and preserve all life to be ruthlessly strategic and efficient in order to somehow outcompete the people who are destroying the world? This is a very serious question. And all those people would prefer to just like go save trees and start, kindergartens and help the whales and do that stuff. And then we have to ask this question of what would be the actual agency sufficient to address the metacrisis. This is like the educational challenge of our time.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Looking forward to connecting again. Thank you to all the listeners, and until next time.